The box was wrong. Reyes knew it before she could have explained why, the way a person sometimes knows a door has been opened in their house without seeing anything out of place, some small wrongness in the air. She set her clipboard on the metal shelf and picked up the evidence bag with 2 fingers, turning it toward the fluorescent tube buzzing above her head. The bag was sealed. The tamper-evident tape was intact along the seam. The chain of custody label on the outside was filled out in blue ink, the handwriting neat and squared off. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who was taught penmanship in elementary school before that stopped mattering. The entry read, methamphetamine crystalline, net weight 847 g, case no. FC 202103334, seizing officer Dep. T. Hargrove, date March 14, 2021. She set the bag down and opened her laptop. She found case FC 202103334 in the Faro County Sheriff's Department Evidence Management System and read the original booking entry, the one created the night of the arrest. That entry read 1,240 grams. She read it again. Then she looked at the bag. Then she looked at the door behind her, which was closed, which she could hear no sound through. Dana pulled out her yellow legal pad she still used legal pads had for 15 years and wrote down the case number, the date, the seizing officer, and both weights. She underlined the discrepancy twice, not because she needed to underline it, but because she was a person who liked to do things with her hands when her mind was moving too fast. She set the pen down and stood still for a moment in the evidence room of the Faro County Sheriff's Department in Bandera, Texas, listening to the fluorescent tube buzz, smelling the particular smell of that room, industrial cleaning solution layered over old cardboard and something faintly chemical that she had never been able to name. And she understood in the flat and factual way she understood most things, that the discrepancy in front of her was not a clerical error. She had driven down from Austin on a Sunday afternoon, arriving in Bandera late enough that the barbecue places were closed, and the only thing open was a Dairy Queen on the highway where she'd eaten a chicken sandwich in her rental car in the parking lot, watching the moths circle the pole light outside. The town itself was the kind of small Texas county seat that still had a working courthouse square, a Masonic lodge, a VFW hall, 2 competing insurance agencies, and a feed-in supply store that had been in the same family since 1947. The streets went quiet early. There were more pickup trucks than sedans, and the ones parked in front of the bars had gun racks and peeling campaign stickers for candidates who'd run 4 or 6 years ago. She checked into a motel on the south end of town. The woman at the front desk had looked at her driver's license for a long time, the way people in small towns sometimes look at you when they can tell you're from somewhere else. Not hostile exactly, just taking inventory. Dana had smiled and taken her key card and dragged her single rolling suitcase to room 114, which smelled like lavender air freshener over something that lavender air freshener was trying to cover. She'd slept 7 hours. She always slept exactly 7 hours on audit trips, not because she set an alarm for 7 hours, but because her body had simply decided this was the correct amount and enforced it without her input. Monday morning, she'd shown up at the Faro County Sheriff's Department at 8:45, which was 15 minutes early. She'd introduced herself to the civilian dispatcher and handed over her state credentials, Dana Reyes, Evidence Compliance Auditor, Texas Department of Public Safety Compliance and Accountability Division. She'd been doing this job for 11 years, and she knew exactly how she was received at small departments, which was tolerated. Sometimes politely, sometimes with a performative friendliness that masked annoyance, rarely welcomed. The dispatcher had called back to the administrative sergeant, who'd come out and shaken her hand and told her they were all ready for her, which meant someone had cleared a table in the back hallway outside the evidence room and left a coffee maker on it that had not been cleaned recently enough. Dana had poured herself a cup anyway and sat down at the table and opened her laptop and her legal pad and begun the process of requesting the evidence logs for the past 18 months, which the sergeant had provided on a thumb drive that she was fairly sure had a college football team logo on it. The job was, on most days, not exciting. That was fine. She had not become a compliance auditor because she wanted excitement. She had become one because she was precise, because she had a tolerance for tedium that most people lacked, and because she found a particular satisfaction in the moment when the numbers matched, the quiet, faintly pleasurable sensation of a system that was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was the same satisfaction, she imagined, that other people got from solving a crossword puzzle. The world was full of systems that were supposed to work a certain way, and most of the time they more or less did, and sometimes she was the person who got to confirm that. And sometimes the numbers didn't match. That was what the job had trained her for, the mismatch, the anomaly, the box that was wrong. Sheriff Ray Colton had been in office since 2009. He was 54 years old, 6'1", and carried himself with the particular kind of relaxed physical authority that comes from spending a long time in a place where most people automatically defer to you. His hair had gone from dark brown to gray in a way that aged him well, made him look seasoned rather than old, and he knew it. He wore his uniform pressed, and his boots shined even on days when he had no public appearances. He coached youth baseball from April through June, had served on the county hospital board for 3 terms, and contributed a paragraph every month to the Bandera Bulletin under the heading, "From the Sheriff's Desk," which his administrative assistant wrote for him but which he edited personally and signed. He was not a cruel man. He had never thought of himself as a corrupt one. When he tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led him to the arrangement he was currently in, the sequence always seemed in the recounting almost logical. There had been no single moment where he'd looked in a mirror and decided to become something he wasn't. There had been instead a series of smaller decisions, each one narrow enough to step over without looking down. The county pension fund collapse had happened in 2018 and had been by every independent account not his fault. The fund manager, a man named Delworth who had since moved to Colorado and was, as far as Colton knew, still alive and not in prison, had made a series of investments that any competent adult should have questioned and nobody had. When it unraveled completely. Colton had been 50 years old and had planned to retire at 55 with 30 years of service, and a pension that would have paid him $68,000 a year for the rest of his life. Instead, what he had was approximately 40 cents on the dollar. The math was not survivable. He had a house with a mortgage he'd refinanced twice and a daughter at Texas A&M, and a wife who had not been well since her thyroid surgery, and who had medical expenses that were real and ongoing. He had not gone looking for Marcus Priest. That part was true. Marcus had come to him. Marcus was his son-in-law. Colton's daughter Kayla had married him at 22, which Colton had privately considered too young and had publicly supported with a smile and a handshake at the rehearsal dinner. Marcus sold auto parts, that's what he said he did. He had a shop in Castroville and it did real business, real enough that it provided plausible cover for the other business, which Colton had not known about until Marcus sat across from him at his own kitchen table with a beer he hadn't been offered and told him. "I can make your problem go away," Marcus had said. "You don't do anything, you just don't see certain things." Colton had told him to get out of his house. That had been in the spring of 2019. By December of that year, he'd called Marcus back. The arrangement was not complicated. Evidence coming through the department from drug interdictions on Highway 16 and State Road 46 was weighed and logged at the scene by the arresting deputy. When that evidence reached the room, logged quantities sometimes, not always, not on a pattern that would jump out, just sometimes, reflected a weight lower than what had been entered in the field. The difference was removed by a single evidence technician, a man named Decker Yount who had a gambling problem and who was grateful for the supplemental income and who also understood, without it being said explicitly, what the consequences of his gratitude ending would be. The difference went to Marcus. Marcus distributed it through a network Colton chose not to know the details of, because knowing the details had never been part of the arrangement. In his own accounting of himself, Colton was not a drug dealer. He was a man who'd been placed in an impossible situation and had found a solution that hurt, in his estimation, no one who wasn't already in the business of being hurt. The drugs that were seized had already been seized. The people who would eventually buy what Marcus distributed were already buying drugs, from someone else if not from Marcus, and so the net effect on the world was, he'd told himself this often enough that it had calcified into something that felt like reason, roughly neutral. The only people who knew were Decker Yount, who was manageable, and Marcus, who was family. He had not known about the 3 overdoses in Uvalde County, or he had chosen not to confirm what he'd started to suspect. Those were different things, he told himself. He was not sure he believed that anymore. Dana spent the first full day going through the logs methodically, the way she always did, building a complete picture of the evidence room's documented inventory before she set foot inside. The management software the department used was a county-licensed system called EvidenceTrack, version 4.2, which she'd seen in 7 other rural county departments and which had a reporting interface that was functional but clunky, the kind of software built by a company that had won a contract rather than competed for users. She pulled 18 months of intake and disposition records and built a parallel spreadsheet, cross-referencing intake quantities against current inventory and against disposition records for evidence that had been sent to the DPS crime lab, returned to courts, or destroyed per court order. Most of it matched. Most evidence room audits had a small error rate that was attributable to paperwork, a case number transposed, a weight entered with a decimal in the wrong position, a disposition recorded in the system before the physical transfer was logged. These were not concerning. These were the noise you filtered out before you could see the signal. By 3 in the afternoon, she had identified 9 cases where the discrepancy between field-logged weight and current inventory was larger than what paperwork error could explain. Not 9 dramatic discrepancies. 4 of them were minor enough that she flagged them for follow-up documentation, but did not yet consider them anomalies requiring escalation. The other 5 were more significant. The largest was the one she'd found in the box, the meth case from March 2021, where nearly 400 grams were unaccounted for. She went home to her motel that evening, and sat on the edge of the bed with her laptop and her legal pad and her chicken sandwich from the same Dairy Queen. And she did not tell herself a story about what she was looking at. She was careful about that. One of the professional disciplines she developed was the discipline of not constructing a narrative before the evidence supported one, because a narrative once built had a gravitational pull that distorted everything you looked at afterward. She did not know what she was looking at. She knew what she was looking at was not clerical error. She texted her supervisor, a man named Greg Ibarra in Austin, and told him she was finding some quantities worth examining. Greg was a thorough man who understood that quantities worth examining from Dana meant something specific and not casual. He replied, "How bad?" She thought about it for a moment and then wrote, "Don't know yet, could be operational sloppiness, could be something else. Give me another 2 days before I characterize it. Take what you need, keep me posted daily." She set the phone on the nightstand. Through the wall she could hear a television in the next room, a laugh track cycling. She opened her laptop and read the FBI's published reporting on evidence theft from law enforcement agencies, which she'd read before but found useful to revisit when she was in this particular position. The patterns were consistent across documented cases: gradual removal, not bulk, concentration on controlled substances with street value. Almost always an inside participant with regular evidence room access. Almost always a financial motive that, in retrospect, the department had either missed or not wanted to find. She closed the laptop and lay back on the bed with her shoes still on and looked at the ceiling for a while. She had done this twice before in her career. Twice in 11 years she'd walked into a routine audit and walked out of something that was not routine. The first time had been a small municipal department in East Texas where a single officer had been stealing cash from seized currency, and the case had been clean and quick, and the officer had been prosecuted and convicted, and she'd given a deposition and it had been fine. The second time had been more complicated, a county in the Panhandle where the corruption had gone 3 levels deep, and her findings had been contested, and she'd received 2 phone calls at her home number that her supervisor had characterized as attempts at intimidation, and that she had characterized privately as something that had frightened her more than she told anyone. She knew the difference between a one-person problem and an institution problem. She was not yet sure which this was. She was starting to be sure it wasn't a one-person problem. Tuesday she went back to the department at 8:30. The administrative sergeant, a heavy-set man named Cruz who wore his shirt tight across the shoulders and who had been perfectly pleasant in a way that asked nothing of either of them, met her at the front with coffee, a different coffee maker she noticed cleaner, and asked if she needed anything. She said she'd like to spend some time in the evidence room itself today, going through physical inventory against the log. He said that was no problem. He walked her back to the evidence room and used his keycard to open the electronic lock. The room was organized in the standard way: metal shelving units bolted to the walls and running in parallel rows down the center, items bagged and tagged and arranged by case number, larger items on lower shelves, bags and envelopes on the upper ones. There was a check-in desk just inside the door where the evidence technician was supposed to be stationed during access. The evidence technician on duty that morning was Decker Yount, 41, a thin man with a shaved head and the kind of pallor that comes from spending most of your working hours in a room with no windows. He looked up when she came in and nodded at her the way you nod at someone you've been told to expect. "Decker Yount," he said, and offered his hand. Dana Reyes, she shook it. His hand was cold and dry and withdrew quickly. "You need anything, I'm right here." "Thank you." She put her laptop and legal pad on the small table that had been set up for her just inside the door and began pulling cases. She worked systematically and she worked slowly, the way you worked when you were trying not to show that you were looking for anything specific. She asked Yount routine questions, standard questions about intake procedures, about how evidence was logged when the field deputy brought it in, about the process for transferring evidence to the lab. He answered them in the flat, practiced way of someone who'd been through this before, or who'd prepared to have been through this before, which was slightly different. Around 10:30, she asked to see the FC20210334 box, the meth case. She'd already seen it the day before, but Yount didn't know that. He went to the shelf and came back with it and set it on the table. "Chain of custody looks right," she said, examining the label. She opened her laptop and pulled up the case file. "I'm seeing the intake weight logged by the field deputy at 1320. Yount said. He was leaning against the check-in desk with his arms crossed loosely. His face was neutral. "And the evidence management system shows 847. A pause that was about a half-second too long. "Lab might have taken a sample." "Lab sample would show up as a disposition entry," she said, and she said it pleasantly, not accusatorially, looking at her laptop screen as though she were simply thinking out loud. "I don't see a disposition entry for this case." "Could be a logging error from intake," Yount said. "Deputy Hargrove sometimes ran long on shifts, might have transposed a number." "That's possible," she wrote something on her legal pad. "Is Deputy Hargrove still with the department?" "Moved over to Kerr County last year." "Okay," she made a note. "I'll want to cross-reference the field report he filed with the booking log. Do you know where I'd pull that?" "Records room, Sergeant Cruz can help you." "Great, thanks." She turned back to her laptop. After a moment she heard Yount move behind her, heard him sit back down at the check-in desk. She kept her eyes on her screen and she wrote on her legal pad in letters small enough that a person across a table could not have read them. "He knew before I said 847. He said lab might have taken a sample before I mentioned the discrepancy. He anticipated the discrepancy." She drew a box around that note. She asked to speak with Sheriff Colton that afternoon. She always requested a mid-audit check-in with the department head. It was standard, expected, the kind of thing that could not be declined without raising questions. Sergeant Cruz set it up for 2 o'clock. Colton's office was at the end of a hallway lined with framed photographs, department portraits going back to the 80s, a few commendations on plaques, a shadow box with a folded flag in it that she guessed was a military item belonging to someone who had died. The office itself was large for a county sheriff's office, with real wood furniture rather than institutional laminate, a window that looked out on the parking lot, and past that, a water tower and the edge of the town's modest skyline. He had a Texas flag and an American flag behind his desk. He had a photograph of a family on the credenza, a woman, a younger woman who looked like his daughter, a man Dana didn't know standing with his arm around the younger woman. Colton stood when she came in and came around the desk to shake her hand. His grip was firm and calibrated, not aggressive. "Ms. Reyes, appreciate your patience with us this week." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "You find everything you need." "Everyone's been very helpful." She sat and opened her legal pad to a clean page. "I just wanted to check in and let you know where we are." "Of course." "Nothing to alarm you," she said, which was what she always said at this point in an audit regardless of what she'd found, because the purpose of this meeting was to make the department head feel that he was being kept informed while giving him no information that could be acted upon before she was ready. "Standard process. I've been going through your intake logs from the past 18 months, cross-referencing with current inventory and disposition records." "How are we looking?" "A few documentation questions I'll want to follow up on. You know how it is, a transposed case number here, a disposition entry that got logged out of sequence. Nothing unusual for a department your size. Good to hear. He leaned back in his chair and crossed one boot over his knee. We try to run a tight shop. It shows, she said. And then, one thing I'll want to do tomorrow is look at your lab submission records for the last 18 months, compare those against your evidence management entries, just to make sure the transfers are all documented correctly on both ends. Something moved in Colton's face, not much, just a slight tightening around the jaw, a micro-adjustment in the way he was holding his shoulders. She noticed it and she let it go and kept her expression pleasant and expectant. I can have Sergeant Cruz pull those for you, he said. That'd be great. Anything else you need? Not right now, she stood and he stood. He shook her hand again. I appreciate the cooperation, Sheriff. That's what we're here for. She walked out. At the end of the hallway, before she turned the corner, she glanced back without stopping, just a natural half-turn as though she'd heard something, and saw him standing in the doorway of his office, watching her go. His face had the particular look of a man calculating something. She turned the corner and kept walking. That night she called Greg Ibarra. It's not sloppiness, she said. The pattern's too consistent and the magnitude's too large. I've got 5 cases where the discrepancy is significant. The largest is nearly 400 grams of methamphetamine. Jesus, a pause, she heard him shift in his chair. Same evidence tech. Evidence tech logs all intake once it arrives at the department, but I want to look at whether there's a pattern by arresting officer. You think it goes deeper than the tech? I think it possibly goes significantly deeper than the tech, she said, and I think I need to be careful about how I proceed from here. Have you talked to anyone in the department about what you're seeing? No, the sheriff requested a check-in and I gave him nothing. Good, another pause. Dana, I need you to think about whether you're comfortable continuing this alone or whether you want company. She thought about the 2 phone calls at her home number from 3 years ago. She thought about the Panhandle County and the way that case had felt once she understood what she was in. I'm comfortable, she said, but I think we need to loop in DPS intelligence, and I think we need to talk about preserving what I've already documented before I dig any deeper. Agreed, I'll make some calls tonight. He paused. You sleeping okay? 7 hours, she said. He almost laughed. Okay, keep your phone on. She sat on the edge of the bed after the call and looked at her legal pad. 9 discrepancy cases laid out in her precise handwriting. Dates, case numbers, arresting officers, logged weights, current inventory weights, differences. The 5 significant ones highlighted with a single straight line of yellow marker she didn't like to over-highlight. It made the page look dramatic and she didn't want drama, she wanted clarity. She turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top, who else? Then she drew a line down the center of the page and on one side wrote evidence room access and on the other side wrote financial motive. She sat with the pen in her hand for a long time and didn't write anything under either heading because she didn't have enough information yet, and she refused to speculate in writing, because speculation, once written, became expectation, and expectation was the enemy of an accurate audit. She turned off the light at 10:15. Wednesday morning, DPS intelligence called her before she got to the department. The agent on the phone was a woman named Specialist Garza. Her first name was Lorna, but she didn't offer it, who was brisk in a way that was not unfriendly, who asked Dana to walk her through what she had found in precise detail, interrupting occasionally to ask clarifying questions that were the questions of someone who knew evidence procedures and knew them well. Dana answered everything. At the end she said, I want to be clear that what I have right now is a documentation discrepancy pattern. It is not proof of theft. It is not proof of where the difference went. It is proof that the numbers don't match and that there's no legitimate documented explanation for the discrepancy. Understood, Garza said. That's actually more than we usually have when we open one of these. I want to look at the lab submission records and I want to look at personnel files for financial irregularities if you can pull those without going through the department. I can pull personnel financials independently. Give me 48 hours. Can you hold on the financial pull until I've secured physical copies of what's in the evidence management system? I don't want anything to disappear before I've documented it. A pause. You think they'd tamper? I think the sheriff knows I'm here, and I think he's smart enough to understand what I'm looking at once I start asking about lab submissions. Can you image the evidence management system database today? I can request an export. Whether they cooperate is a different question. Request the export through official channels this morning, Garza said. If they delay or deny, that's itself significant and I can move up the timeline on our end. If they provide it, you have what you need. Okay. Dana, the use of her first name was a small signal. If at any point you feel like the situation in that building has changed, you call me immediately, not after, immediately. I will. She drove to the department. She parked in the visitor spots. She sat in the car for a moment in the August heat, which was already pressing at 92 degrees at 8 in the morning and would be at 100 by noon. Through the windshield she could see the building, a county building from the early 90s, brick and flat-roofed, with a cruiser parked in the side lot and a flag that hung motionless in the still air. An ordinary building in an ordinary town. Inside it were people who drove the same roads as everyone else, ate at the same barbecue places, coached the same youth sports. She got out of the car and went inside. The export request went to Sergeant Cruz at 9 that morning. She framed it as standard procedure, which it was DPS auditors were entitled to request electronic copies of any evidence management records as part of a scheduled audit, and the department was required to provide them within 72 hours. Cruz said he'd get it taken care of. His face showed nothing. She did not know if he knew anything, and she added him to the list of people she needed to understand better. She spent the morning in the evidence room again. Yount was quieter today. He'd been quieter yesterday afternoon too after the conversation about the meth case, and she'd noticed a shift in his quality of stillness. He was more careful now, more aware of where she was in the room at any given moment. Not hostile, just aware. She found it interesting that he hadn't moved away from his post, hadn't called in sick, hadn't done anything that would have flagged him as irregular. Either he was composed or he'd been told to stay put, or both. She pulled the lab submission files at 11. Sergeant Cruz brought them in 3 binders, each one corresponding to a 6-month window. She worked through them the way she worked through everything, page by page, cross-referencing each DPS lab submission record against the corresponding entry in the evidence management system. Most matched. A few had minor discrepancies in transfer dates that were explainable by processing delay. The lab got backed up, evidence arrived a day or 2 later than the submission form showed, that kind of thing. Normal, boring. And then she found the submission record for FC 202103334. The lab submission had been logged in EvidenceTrack 2 weeks after the field booking. The weight listed on the submission form to the lab, the weight that should have matched the field booking weight of 1,240 grams, read 847 grams. The form was signed by Decker Yount. The date stamp was March 28, 2021. Which meant the weight had been adjusted before the evidence left the building, before it went to the lab. Which meant the lab had received 847 grams, had processed 847 grams, had returned confirmation on 847 grams, and had never known there was a discrepancy because the discrepancy had happened before the evidence reached them. She photographed the form with her phone. She photographed the corresponding entry in EvidenceTrack. She photographed the chain of custody label on the bag itself. She did this methodically and without hurrying, because the most important thing in this moment was not to convey urgency to the man sitting 12 feet behind her. She found the same pattern in 2 other cases. FC 202100501, a seizure of 2.3 kilograms of methamphetamine logged by Field Deputy Carlos Esteban, reduced to 1.8 kilograms before lab submission, signed by Yount March 2021. And FC 202200178, cocaine, 654 grams in the field, 490 grams to the lab, signed by Yount, January 2022. She photographed everything. She kept her face neutral and her movements unhurried, and when Yount asked if she needed anything she said no, she was just going through some submission dates, almost done. At 12:30 she took a lunch break. She drove to the Dairy Queen and parked in the far corner of the lot and called Garza. I have physical documentary evidence of pre-submission weight adjustment, she said. Signed by the evidence tech, 3 cases confirmed, possibly more. A long pause. How do you want to play this? I want to finish the day normally, give them no reason to believe anything's changed. Tonight I want to get everything I've photographed and documented to you electronically. Tomorrow morning I'll request a meeting with the sheriff to discuss my preliminary findings, normal end-of-audit procedure, and I'll give him enough to understand that the discrepancy documentation exists without giving him enough to know how complete my record is. That's a risk. Everything from here is a risk, Dana said. But if I don't complete the audit protocol, it looks like something spooked me, and if something spooked me, they'll try to understand what spooked me, and that's worse. Agreed, Garza paused. We've been running parallel on our end. I don't want to give you too much yet because I want your audit to remain clean and independent, but I'll say that your instinct about the depth of this is not wrong. Dana looked out through the windshield at the empty parking lot, the heat shimmer coming off the asphalt, the same pole light with the same moths that wouldn't be visible until dark. Is it his family? She asked. Silence on the line. Then how did you know to ask that? The photograph on his credenza, a man I didn't recognize. I've been running it through possibilities. You're thorough, Garza said. I'm just doing my job, Dana said. Colton knew something was wrong by Wednesday afternoon. He couldn't have said exactly what told him some change in the frequency of Decker Yount's texts, which had gone from the usual nothing to a message that said auditor pulled lab submissions and nothing after that, which meant either everything was fine or Decker had decided silence was the better strategy. Colton had seen enough of human behavior under pressure to know that silence from Decker did not mean everything was fine. He'd called Marcus from his personal cell, standing in the parking lot behind the department at 5:15 with the August heat still radiating off the asphalt. Marcus had answered on the second ring. There a problem, Marcus said. I don't know yet. She finds something. I don't know. Colton watched a deputy pull out of the lot in a cruiser, the air conditioning condensation dripping off the undercarriage onto the hot pavement, evaporating immediately. The audit's supposed to be done Thursday. Then wait till Thursday. I'm not calling you to get waited at, Colton said quietly. A pause. What do you want me to do, Ray? I want you to sit on your hands and let this play out. The lab weights are what they are. If she's matched those against field logs and she's got a discrepancy, it looks like a documentation issue. That's what it looks like from the outside. Decker made an error. Decker's not going to hold. Decker will hold. He didn't believe that entirely, but the alternative to believing it was a shape he didn't want to look at directly. I'll call you tomorrow. He hung up and stood there for another moment in the heat. He was 54 years old and he was tired in a way that had started about 2 years ago and had not left. Not physical tired, the other kind. He had a meeting with the hospital board on Friday. He had a baseball team to get back to in the spring. He had a daughter who was pregnant, who did not know what her husband did, who had called him just last week to ask if he was coming for Thanksgiving. He had a wife whose prescriptions cost $1,100 a month even with insurance. He had a county that trusted him. He went back inside. Thursday morning, Dana sent everything she documented, photographs, spreadsheet notes from both legal pads, timeline of the discrepancies, to Garza's secure upload portal where it would be received, timestamped, and stored independent of the Faro County Sheriff's Department systems. She had also on Wednesday night compiled a complete set of her own working documents and emailed them encrypted to Greg Ibarra. She was careful. She had always been careful. It was one of the qualities she appreciated in herself without finding it remarkable. She requested the meeting with Sheriff Colton for 9 o'clock. He was already in his office when she arrived, and he had, she noticed, a legal pad of his own on the desk. That was new. There had been no legal pad at their Monday meeting. Ms. Reyes, he stood. They shook hands again, same grip. Sheriff, she sat. He sat. She set her legal pad on her knee and her pen at the top of the page in the natural way, the way someone sits who is about to take notes. I'm wrapping up today and I wanted to walk you through my preliminary findings before I compile my formal report. Appreciate that. You'll receive the full written report within 10 business days. This is just a courtesy briefing on the areas I'll be flagging. Of course. For the most part, your evidence management is solid. Documentation protocols are followed. Chain of custody is maintained on the vast majority of your inventory. I found 4 cases with minor logging discrepancies, case numbers entered incorrectly, 1 disposition recorded out of sequence. These are procedural notes that require corrective documentation but no significant concern. She watched his shoulders drop nearly imperceptibly. "However," she said, and she kept her voice even and conversational as though this were also routine, "I did find a more significant discrepancy pattern in 5 additional cases that I'll need to address in the report. Specifically, instances where the weight logged in the field by the arresting deputy does not match the weight listed on the subsequent DPS lab submission form." Colton's face did not change. He was good. He was better than Yount at this. But there was something in his eyes, not panic, not even fear exactly, more like a man who has just heard a sound in the distance that he recognizes. "How significant?" he asked. "Significant enough that I'll be recommending a follow-up review at the state level," she said. "The differences are too large to attribute to measurement error or documentation. I want to be transparent with you about that." "Do you have a hypothesis about the cause?" It was an interesting question, a careful question. She noted it. "At this point, I'm not in the business of hypotheses. I'm in the business of accurate documentation of what the records show. The state review team will draw their own conclusions." "Is there something I should be doing in the meantime, on our end?" "Normal operations," she said. "The records I've referenced are already documented in my working file. I'd ask that nothing in the evidence room be removed or altered pending the formal review, but that's a standard request at this stage." "Of course," he nodded slowly. "We'd cooperate fully." "I know you would." He stood. She gathered her legal pad and extended her hand, and he shook it, and she looked at him directly for a moment, not challenging, just professional, the look of one person acknowledging another, and she said, "Thank you for your department's cooperation this week. Everyone was very helpful." "Safe drive back to Austin," he said. She walked out. In the parking lot, she sat in the rental car with the engine running and the AC on and her hands in her lap for about 2 minutes. The legal pad was on the passenger seat. The pen was uncapped. She hadn't taken a single note in Colton's office, not because she'd forgotten but because she hadn't needed to. She would remember the meeting precisely. She always did, and also because she'd wanted her hands free and her attention undivided. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove past the feed store and the Masonic Lodge and the courthouse square and out onto the highway. At a gas station 4 miles north of town, she stopped and filled the tank and texted Garza, "Meeting complete. He's smart. He'll move today." Garza replied in 6 minutes, "We're ready, good work." She got back on the highway and drove north toward Austin through the August heat, the landscape brown and dry on either side, the occasional cedar break and limestone outcropping, the sky white and featureless from the heat, and somewhere behind her a town that looked quiet from the outside. Marcus Preece was arrested on a Thursday evening 6 weeks later at his auto parts shop in Castroville by a joint task force from DPS Criminal Investigations and the DEA, which had been, as it turned out, already building a case from a different direction. 2 years of cell tower data, financial records, and a confidential informant who'd been flipped in a separate Bixar County case had built a picture of Marcus's distribution network that was thorough enough that the assistant U.S. attorney in San Antonio had called the Faro County evidence discrepancies an independent corroborating thread in his motion to the federal grand jury. Marcus came out of the shop with his hands up when they announced. He did not run. He was 41 years old and he was intelligent enough to understand the arithmetic of the situation. He also, according to the arrest report, asked immediately for his attorney and said nothing else. Decker Yount was arrested the same day at his apartment on the south side of Bandera. He was taken into custody, processed at the county jail in the adjacent county, arraigned on 2 counts of evidence tampering and 1 count of distribution facilitation, and held on $50,000 bond that he could not meet. He agreed to a proffer agreement with the federal prosecution within 4 days. Sheriff Ray Colton was not arrested that Thursday. The investigation continued, because the bar for arresting a sitting elected law enforcement officer in his own county required a degree of documentation that the assistant U.S. attorney was careful about meeting. The FBI's San Antonio field office took over that thread. Colton was served with a preservation order for all records and devices. He retained an attorney, a criminal defense lawyer from San Antonio named Herrera, who had a reputation for representing public officials in federal cases and who charged accordingly. For 11 weeks, Colton continued to go to work every day. He ran his department. He contributed his paragraph to the Bandera Bulletin. He sat on the hospital board. He did not return Marcus's calls. He drove to his daughter's house in Castroville on 2 Sundays and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and did not talk about what was happening. And Kayla, who was 7 months pregnant and who was processing her husband's arrest in her own way, asked him once, quietly, across the kitchen table, "Did you know?" He looked at his coffee. "Dad, this isn't a conversation we can have, sweetheart." She didn't speak to him for 3 weeks after that. The federal grand jury returned an indictment against Colton in November on 4 counts. Conspiracy to tamper with government evidence, distribution facilitation, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law. The last count attached because one of the defendants in a case whose evidence had been skimmed had served an additional 18 months on a plea deal based partly on the quantity of drugs attributed to him, a quantity that the prosecution could demonstrate had been artificially inflated before the skimming to allow Yount to bring the weight down to the actual seized amount and still clear a prosecution threshold. That was the detail that made the story real. Not the drugs, not the money. A man who had done something wrong, who'd been sentenced for more of it than he'd actually done, who'd sat in a cell for a year and a half longer than he should have because the numbers in a log had been manipulated twice. Once to inflate them, once to bring them back down, and the net effect had fallen on a person who hadn't been part of the calculation at all. The Bandera Bulletin covered the indictment on its front page. The San Antonio Express News ran it above the fold. There were 2 days of television coverage from San Antonio stations, reporters standing in front of the Faro County Sheriff's Department building with the flag behind them, saying the things reporters say in front of county buildings. Then the news cycle moved on to other things the way it does. The arraignment was in federal court in San Antonio. Dana drove down from Austin on a Tuesday morning because she had been asked to appear by the prosecutor's office, not to testify, just to be available, in case questions arose about the audit documentation during the preliminary hearing. She sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench for 4 hours and was never called. She did not go into the courtroom when it was open to the public. She stayed in the hallway with her laptop on her knees, working on an audit for a municipal department in Corpus Christi that had nothing to do with any of this. Around noon, a prosecutor's paralegal came out and thanked her, and said they wouldn't need her today and that her documentation had been, in the paralegal's words, incredibly useful. Dana said she was glad to hear it and meant it simply and without ceremony. She drove back to Austin in the afternoon traffic, the highway thick with the particular congestion of a city that had grown faster than its infrastructure. She got home at 6 and made pasta and ate at her kitchen table and texted her sister in Houston, who texted back a photo of her nephew who had recently learned to walk and who appeared in the photo to be walking directly into a coffee table. She wrote back a laughing emoji and then set the phone down. The legal pad from Bandera was on her kitchen counter. She had not needed it since she'd filed her formal audit report. She would file it with the case materials when the prosecution requested her complete working documents, which they would. Until then, it just sat there, 18 pages of handwritten notes and cross-references and numbers that didn't match. She thought sometimes about the man who had sat in a cell for an extra 18 months. She didn't know his name, it hadn't been released publicly in connection with the Colton case. She hoped someone had told him why. She suspected that was not how it worked. She cleared her plate and washed it and set it in the drying rack and dried her hands and stood at the kitchen sink for a moment, looking out the window at the alley behind her apartment building, the dumpsters and the back of the Mexican restaurant next door. The single light mounted above its back door that was always on. The moths were there too, orbiting the light the way they always did, the same as the pole light at the Dairy Queen in Bandera, the same as every light everywhere that she had ever stood near in the dark. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Ray Colton pleaded guilty on a Friday in February to 2 counts, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and obstruction. The other 2 counts were dropped as part of the plea agreement. He would be sentenced in 60 days, and the sentencing guidelines, his attorney had told him privately, put him at 32 to 40 months in federal custody. He would serve that time in a minimum security facility somewhere. He would lose his law enforcement certification permanently. He would lose his pension, what remained of it, as a condition of the guilty plea. He would be required to cooperate with the ongoing investigation into Marcus's distribution network. which had, in the course of the 18 months since his son-in-law's arrest, been found to extend into 4 counties, and to have been connected, through 2 intermediary distributors, to an overdose death in Uvalde County in the summer of 2022, a 23-year-old woman who had been found in her car at the edge of a park. Colton didn't read about her in the indictment. He'd already read about her in the newspaper 2 months before, back when the connection was first reported. He'd read the paragraph 3 times. Her name was Adriana Molina. She'd been a certified nursing assistant at a care facility in Uvalde. She had a son who was 2 years old. He had not known about her when he'd called Marcus back in December of 2019. He had not known about her when he'd decided that the net effect on the world was roughly neutral. He was not sure it mattered in terms of the accounting that he hadn't known. He had spent a significant portion of the last 8 months trying to determine whether it mattered, and he had not resolved it, and he was not sure he would. After the plea, he drove home alone. His attorney had offered a ride, but Colton had declined, and sat in the parking lot of the courthouse for a while before he started the car. The February sky was flat gray and cold, which was unusual for San Antonio in February, and the wind was moving paper cups across the concrete in the way wind always does when the parking lot is empty. He sat there until the cold reached into the car enough to be uncomfortable. Then he started the engine and drove back to Bandera to finish what remained of the job that his deputy chief would be taking over in 60 days. He had not called Kayla. He would call Kayla when he got home. He'd been calling her every week since November, and she'd been answering, and they'd been talking for 10 or 15 minutes about things that were not the main thing, and that had been enough. It had been something. The drive home was 2 hours. He did it without the radio. Dana got the sentencing notification by email on a Thursday, the automated notification that the prosecutor's office sends to all witnesses and documentary contributors in federal cases when sentencing is completed. Colton had received 37 months. He had been remanded immediately. She read the email at her desk in Austin. Then she closed it and opened the Corpus Christi audit file she'd been working on, a straightforward property evidence discrepancy that appeared to be exactly what it looked like. A single officer who'd been improperly signing out items for use in sting operations without following proper documentation protocol, sloppy but not criminal, requiring a corrective procedure memo and additional training. She pulled up the property log and her spreadsheet and began running the comparison. The numbers were what they were, most of them matched. She looked for the ones that didn't. And